The Southwest Missouri State University Department of Geography-Geology presents Land and Life in the Ozarks. This course is one of several units of study offered in Ozark Regional Studies at SMSU and is designed to enhance appreciation of the cultural heritage of this region.
The lecture today will deal with lumbering and forestry. Because forests do comprise a striking element of the cultural landscape of the region, and because, as we've talked about earlier, the settlement of the region and population, location of railroads, roads, and towns were affected by the lumbering industry, it is deserving of our attention. And certainly today, forests and the lumbering industry is of some consequence to the region. I'll be talking about specifically three things: the era of forest exploitation, the era of forest management, which was introduced around the 1930s, and then current uses of the Ozark forest. I think to begin, we might simply go back to a map that we used earlier in this course to simply review the types of forests that are in the Ozarks. So if we can turn our attention to the map to begin with. This is a map that you've seen before, but to refresh your memory, the main forests of the Ozark region are the pine and hardwood forests in the southeast, a mixed forest. These forests are found to some extent in the Arkansas Ozarks, in the White River country, and to a lesser extent in the Boston Mountains. There are extensive areas of glade land on the Arkansas-Missouri boundary. These are primarily cedar trees, or at least the cedars are the most important trees economically in the glades. The rest of the Ozarks, which is shown in brown here, is an oak-hickory forest, and for the most part, the interior counties are the most heavily forested. The rugged districts are the most heavily forested. These districts here in the eastern Ozarks are more than 80% forested. Those in the Boston Mountains and the White River country, more than 80% forested. And much of the interior district, or the section of the Ozarks, are over 60% forested. So by and large, the border districts are somewhere between 20 and 60% forested. That would be the eastern and northern, and also the Springfield Plain section. So we have the most forest land, or the heaviest forest land, in the interior section of the Ozarks. Now, the era of forest exploitation, of course, on a really truly commercial scale, began in the 1880s and 1890s when railroads penetrated the area. We know that there were sawmills on the Gasconade River in 1818. These were reported by Schoolcraft, but for the most part, real or large-scale commercial forestry had to wait for railroads such as the St. Louis and Iron Mountain, which was built eventually to Poplar Bluff and on beyond. The Kansas City to Memphis run through Springfield was built in the 1880s. Then the Missouri and North Arkansas line through the White River country. And from then these major through railroads, branch lines were built into the better forest lands, and commercial forestry was underway. And really this was part of a overall forestry that was entering the, or lumbering era, I should say, that was sweeping across the southern states during this same time. And this was a time, you must understand, that when settlement was going on rapidly in the Great Plains, and also even in the Corn Belt to some extent, to a considerable extent. Houses, barns, fences, and so forth were being built at a very rapid rate, and railroads were being expanded. It took 3,000 cross ties to build a mile of railroad. And of course the oak of the Ozarks was the most readily accessible to the Great Plains and also to the Corn Belt. During this time, large acreages were purchased by eastern interests for the most part, and some of the operators that had, as the forests were depleted in the Great Lakes states, they moved into the Ozarks and purchased large tracts of land and developed them, these properties for lumbering. Towns grew up, such as Doniphan and Leeper, Grandin, Winona, most of these in the pine mixed forest area in the eastern Ozarks. But Chadwick in the western Ozarks represented another of these boom towns associated with forestry. If we just trace the history of Grandin, for instance, in the southeastern Ozarks, this town was, I suppose, typical of the large company town that was developed. It was founded in 1887 by the Missouri Lumber and Mining Company, and they purchased properties in Reynolds, Butler, Carter, Ripley, Shannon, and Wayne counties, 6 different counties. The site of Grandin was selected because there was a natural pond there in which the logs could be dumped and then to await sawing. It really took on aspects of a boom town because the company hauled in prefabricated houses on the railroad, and these houses usually were 4-room, sometimes 2-room houses, were rented for $4 a month. And to show you just how rapidly this did go on, by 1900, this company was collecting $12,000 a month rent from these houses. So this means that they had something like 3,000 houses in Grandin and in other towns and scattered through the eastern Ozark forest. The company supplied medical services. They had 6 doctors on their staff at one time. And Grandin had, at its maximum extent around 1900, or maximum development, 2 large mills which handled 220,000 board feet per day. There were 4 planing mills, there were 14 drying kilns, and over 30 storage sheds. And it required 90 carloads of timber every day to keep these mills operating. Now this of course required a lot of cutting. And in 1900 the company employed 1,200 people. The town had grown to a population of 3,000. And then just in a short time later, just a decade later, by 1910, the whistle blew for the last time in the mills, and the company had shut down. So in a period of 23 years, they had cut out the timber on their property and bought timber from adjacent lands that farmers brought in. So the area had been cut over in really just a little more than a generation. By 1938, the population of Grandin had declined to 300 people, from 3,000 to 300 in just a period of 20 years or so. And the present population is very little change, really. It's, I think, 260 people. Well, Chadwick in the western Ozarks had a similar history, although on a much smaller scale. The railroad was built into Chadwick in Christian County in 1883. The Hobart Lee Tie and Timber Company was another large operation in which did establish company stores in Chadwick and also at Sparta. And they purchased primarily the lumber from farms, and I suspect that most of the lumber was purchased from farmers, that is, from small holdings. But there were large holdings there, too. The Springdale Ranch, which was located south of Chadwick, had over 8,600 acres in their holding, and they had a lumber mill there that ran for some 35 years, up until the 1920s. Let's, if we can look at the first slide, we see just how fast this exploitation of timber really did take place. Here's a map that shows virgin timber. Each dot represents 25,000 acres of virgin timber. And as you can see, the Ozark region, like the rest of the South, or the area to the south, was very heavily forested with virgin timber in 1850. Then if we can look at the next slide, you see that not only was the Ozarks essentially deforested, there was very little virgin timber left by 1926, but this was true of the whole eastern part of the United States. It was a time of very rapid forest exploitation. In the next slide, we see a view of logs being built into rafts and floating on the, in this case, on the Missouri River. Very little of this actually was done because the rivers of the Ozarks were too small for rafting of anything except railroad ties. They did raft ties to a considerable extent. In the next slide, we see some of the equipment that they used to fasten the rafts together. A branding hammer was used, or the ties or logs were notched in some manner to prove ownership. In the next slide, we see an early day logging activity in Christian County near Chadwick. I think this was around 1917 after, because the Caterpillar was pulling the log trailers by that time. In the next picture, we see a small private sawmill run by a steam engine. This is the Bridges Mill, which operated for a number of years south and east of Chadwick on Bull Creek. And in the next slide, we see the Shootback Mill on Chestnut Ridge, typical of hundreds of small independent sawmills that were established during the lumber era. And many of these, of course, are still operating today. Well, what were the consequences of the timber boom? One thing we've already mentioned would be just the growth of population and then a decline of population. Now, the decline of population usually went on somewhat slower because as the large properties were sold off, very often the people who worked in the mill stayed on, bought the properties for nominal amounts, and attempted to carry on some type of agriculture. Usually small truck farms or fruit farms were established. We've talked about that earlier. Certainly the forest resources were depleted to a considerable extent. And if we can have the next slide here, this is typical of an awful lot of Ozark forest today. Small saplings, crowded, and not much chance for growth of a large tree, simply because it is not, or partly at least, because it is not properly managed. Also, in addition to just the depletion of the forest resource, there was depletion of related resources. In 1937, when the Missouri Conservation Commission was established, they assessed the deer population at 3,500 deer, which is a tiny population, and certainly habitat modification had an important part to play in that. The Soil Conservation Service did a survey in the 1930s that showed that half of the topsoil of the Ozarks had been removed by that time. Now, more had been removed outside the timbered areas, but you must remember that there's very little soil in these rugged hill districts, and so if you lose half, you've lost an awful lot. Well, the era of timber management really began in the 1930s. There were several federal projects such as the WPA and the PWA and the Civilian Conservation Corps, which carried out work. But one of the most significant things was simply the purchase of forest land by the federal government under the Weeks Law of 1911, which permitted this. These purchases were made in the Ozarks in the 1930s. The Ozark National Forest, the Mark Twain National Forest, and the Clark National Forest are important forests in the Ozarks today. And if I can have the next slide, we see the forested, or the national forests of the United States. And you see a cluster of these forests in the Ozarks. They do exist as management districts. They're fragmented. The most southerly there is the Ouachita National Forest. It's really outside the Ozarks, but it is about the only area in the midsection of the country with national forest land. Now, within any of these properties, it turns out that, and if we can come in very close on a map here, this is actually a close-up shot, if you can bring the camera in here, of the Ava district in the Mark Twain National Forest. Really, the ownership pattern within each of these districts is about 50-50 private as opposed to federal ownership. The green area, which may not show up too well, but these are actual federally owned lands. The white areas are still privately owned, and in each of these districts, the approximate figure is about half private and half federally owned. In general, the federal lands are the most rugged parts. Along the better roads and along the river valleys, private ownership is still pretty much the rule. One of the things that the Forest Service did was to inaugurate fire control. Now, if we can have the next slide, we see here a traditional Ozark practice that's still carried on today, and that is what's known as greening up. That is to burn the leaf litter out in the spring in order to allow the grass to come through, and then the forest can be used for graze. Well, in the Ava district, for example, there were 200 to 600 fires annually until very recent years. In the 30s, a number of these fires were set intentionally so that people could find employment with the Forest Service putting the fires out. In recent years, these fires have been reduced to about 20 to 25 per year in that same district. And now the Forest Service does use, to some considerable extent, fire as a management technique, but they burn primarily in the fall when it is there's quite a lot less damage done. Well, open range grazing was another management technique that was used or established by, or I should say open range grazing was prohibited by the Forest Service. It's really interesting that the open range grazing was not prohibited by law in the state of Missouri until 1969. Now, many counties had eliminated open range grazing. Now, open range grazing is damaging to forestry, if not at least properly controlled. Grazing has to be controlled, particularly damage from goats and sheep and animals that forage on trees. Timber management practices of various types, salvage cutting, improvement cutting, pruning, reseeding, were inaugurated by the Forest Service and to some extent copied by private owners. In the next slide, we see an example of this. Here's some of the pine country in the Clark National Forest, and here they have practiced selective cutting and reseeding. You see the small pines in the foreground. Now, incidentally, the Forest Service, the revenues they get from the pines that they cut and other lumber that they sell, and also the grazing permits or fees that they collect, are 25% of that goes back to the county into the general revenue fund, and I think another 10% goes into the county road fund. Now, I'd like next to look at the current pattern of forest utilization in the Ozarks. And I have some posters here that I think you might find interesting. This shows the ownership of forests in the Ozarks. And for the most part, farmers are the main owners of the forest, and by and large, private ownership, it runs, well, let's see, anywhere between 11% in the southwestern Ozarks down to only 2% in the eastern Ozarks. So most of it is in private ownership, and farmers account for from 63% up to 3/4 of the total ownership. And I think this is a significant thing to point out, because if we are going to have good forest management, it's going to have to be done in the private sector. The national forests simply do not have, or the public simply doesn't own enough of the forest. Now, in this next chart, we see the actual volume or acreage, I should say, of saw timber in the Ozarks. And this is, again, regionalized. This is the northwest Ozarks, the southwest Ozarks, and the eastern Ozarks. And what we find is that softwoods, or the pines, account for only 1% in the northwest Ozarks. They account for some 2% in the eastern Ozarks and 9% in the southwestern Ozarks. Most of the volume of saw timber, that is timber large enough to be sawed into boards, is or consists of hardwood, and most of that is oak. Oak accounts from anywhere from 70 to 80% of the total volume of saw timber. Various species of oak. Here's white oak at 24%, black oak at 30%, post oak at 17%, and other species of oak at 11%. And these percentages run fairly close to the same throughout the Ozarks, and by and large, that is the pattern of cut too. For the largest volume of saw timber cut in the Ozarks is oak. And then a final chart just to put forestry somewhat in perspective. And this is, I should emphasize that this is forest products sold $2.5 million in 1969. This is taken from the agricultural census. Now, this is sold from farms. It does not include other private ownership and also public ownership. But when we compare that to, say, other figures, and if you can come over with the camera, we see agriculture accounts for $735 million, as opposed to forestry with $2.5 million. And if we look at mineral production, $218 million in the Ozarks. So forestry, as far as the dollar value, is fairly low. Now, I think an important point we might make there is that an awful lot of people do find employment in the forestry industry because many of the sawmills are small operations and they do use a good deal of labor. Now, I'd like in the remaining time that we have simply to look at some of the forest products that are used or are produced in the Ozarks. So if we can have the first slide, here we see the typical way in which logs find their way to market now by truck. Rail is used very little, really. In the next picture, we see a peeling operation. Here, this is at Mountain View, Missouri, and the pine logs are being peeled in preparation for manufacture of poles. In the next slide, these poles then are loaded onto a tram, which carries them into a creosoting cooker. Now, in the next slide, we see the logs entering the creosote cooker. It's really a large sort of a pressure cooker in which the creosote is impregnated into the logs using heat and pressure. In the next picture, we see what the cooker actually looks like. I guess it's a large-scale pressure cooker. The creosote is a preservative. Here's the finished product on the other end, which can be used for building pole barns and so forth. A lot of it is consumed locally. In the next picture, we see creosoted posts with the pointed ends, which is some indication that they're probably going to be used locally in the rocky Ozark hills. In the next slide, we see a pile of railroad ties, which is still an important product of the Ozark forest. They're sawed today as opposed to being hacked as they were in the early day with an axe. In the next slide, we see a planing mill, and this particular operation is one of the larger ones, and it does have a planing mill, and they do a certain amount of manufacturing of wood products there. In the next slide, we see some of these products, loading chutes, feed bunks, primarily products that can be sold locally. Most of their flooring and oak flooring and so forth is shipped out of the area. In the next slide, we see a small sawmill operation. There are many of these that are very marginal, and each year a certain number of them close because they can't compete with the larger mills. Quite often, as the machinery becomes obsolete, these people simply use their trucks or some of their equipment and go to work for one of the larger companies. In the next slide, we see one of these abandoned sawmills, relic machinery amongst scrub timber, and this is quite typical of the Ozark region. In the next slide, we see charcoal kilns. Now, this is an industry which has come back to the Ozarks. It was an important industry in the iron smelting days, before when there was a considerable amount of iron smelted in the Ozarks, but it's come back after having almost got passed from the scene. It's come back largely because of the popularity of the backyard barbecue and a rejuvenated market for the product, and there have been a lot of new kilns established in recent years. In the next slide, we see some of the timber that is exploited. Gum is on the left, mainly a bottomland hardwood in the eastern Ozarks and not used to any great extent. Hickory in the middle and cedar on the left. Cedar is especially important as a closet lining and to some extent in manufacture of tourist curios. In the next slide we see cottonwood, which is used very little, but the black oak in the middle is used quite a lot for posts especially, and on the right side is pine, which is used both as dimension lumber and also as post material and pole material. And in the next slide we see post oak at the left, a very popular tree for manufacture of posts. In the middle is the Osage orange or hedge, which makes an extremely resistant post, and the elm on the right is used very little. In the next slide we see some of the uses of hickory. Hickory is especially preferred for the manufacture of handles because it is resistant and quite springy, and also for charcoaling as well. In the next slide is a view of probably the most valuable tree in the Ozark region as far as a single tree is concerned, or type of tree. This is walnut, quite a large walnut tree. It's about 100 years old. It was naturally seeded sometime around 1867, at about the time the Alaska Purchase was made, and it was cut in 1963 when the year when President Kennedy was assassinated. Well, this tree is, or this wood is especially preferred for manufacture of furniture, as a veneer wood, for manufacture of gun stocks, and so on. In the next slide, we see some of the gun stocks that are manufactured from walnut. There are a number of companies that do this in the Ozarks, not only gun stocks, but also walnut bowls and various other types of items built from or manufactured from walnut. In the next picture, we see another product that comes from the walnut tree, and this is the nut itself. A traditional occupation in the Ozarks, or a practice in the Ozarks, was to gather walnuts in the fall. It was used as a food, not only for man, but for poultry and for hogs as well. Hogs can crack those things, believe it or not. Today, they're gathered, and it has become an important industry, largely because of the invention of new machinery. In the next picture, we see some of the walnuts that are collected at the Hammond's Product Company at Stockton, Missouri. Each of those bags contains 50 pounds of hulled walnuts. In the next slide, we see the cracking equipment. It is all mechanized. In the next slide, actually, not only the nuts are used, but the shell is used as well. Here, the shell is bagged, and oil companies purchase this to pump down into their wells and seal off leaks. It works very fine for that. In the next slide, we see the distribution of black walnuts is quite widespread in the eastern part of the United States, but most of the gathering of walnuts for nuts occurs in the Ozarks because of frost limitations, weather limitation, drought in the western sections in Kansas and Oklahoma, poor soil conditions, and disease in the eastern states, and the fact that they've cut out a lot of their walnut. In the next slide, we see the actual production of kernels averaged over a 3-year period. And we see that the western Ozarks is certainly the most important production region for black walnut kernels. Each dot there represents 10,000 pounds. And Greene County, Missouri, collects more black walnuts than any other county in the United States. Now, in the next series of slides, I'll hurry through these. I wanted to show you this because it's an interesting management practice. Here's some of the old tri-state land. Very desolate-looking land. In the next picture, we see what one person has done to improve this land, bulldozing it out, preparing it for pasture. And in the next picture, we see the end result of this, a nice fescue pasture with walnut trees left behind, which came up volunteer. And I'm sure this is a very expensive operation, but quite an interesting operation as far as a land management technique. And I suppose it means that if you want to spend enough, you can make mind over land look pretty good. Finally, then, in the last slide, we see that there has been some interest in planting of native black walnut as an orchard crop, and this is a planting that was made in 1947 near Marionville, Missouri. Well, this concludes my presentation on lumbering and forestry in the Ozarks. In the next lecture, I'll be talking about the tourist industry.
For course information concerning land and life in the Ozarks, contact Dr. Milton Rafferty, Department Head, Geography Geology, Southwest Missouri State University, Springfield, Missouri, 65802.